Hello, my name is Fredio Salmon Mujage from Edukea Tanzania. I'm a History 2 teacher of advanced level. Welcome. In this session, proceed with our topic, which is threats to the world peace after Second World War. On the last session, we ended on looking the definition of NATO and the Warsaw Pact and their periodization. So now let us see the ways on how NATO and Warsaw Pact intensified the Cold War. The first way was through forming international spy networks. It means that those military alliances which was formed by that time in 1989, 1949 and 1955 respectively, really all intensified the Cold War in forming the international spy networks. For example, NATO used the CIA and the FBI as spy networks, and Israel used the Mossad in the ensuring of containing the spread of communism. But also Warsaw Pact on the other end used the KDG, and CIB. These were the spy networks which were used by each blocks in the collection of international information which were basing or concerning with those eastern and the western blocks. And through forming those international spy networks intensified the Cold War in one way or another, whereby each spy network was spying on other or against the enemy or their enemies. So that led to the intensification of Cold War. But another way was through intensifying arms race. This was the way whereby those military alliances were intensifying Cold War. In which sense? In the sense that the arms race were increasing in production of deadly weapons or nuclear weapons, whereby USSR come up with the establishment and the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were deadly weapons and were tested in Kazakhstan and Balapan. These were the nuclear weapons which was done by USSR. But on the other hand, USA come up with the same idea of manufacturing nuclear weapons of intermediate range ballistic missiles, and the nuclear weapons which was made during the Manhattan Project in 1942. So these were the intensification of Cold War, whereby those blocs or military alliances were involving themselves in production of nuclear weapons. Another was through oiling international terrorism. This was the actions whereby the leaders of one bloc was assassinating or were assassinating by their enemies. For example, the assassination of Indira Gandhi of India and the other leaders were due to the movements or the anti-communist organization which assassinated those leaders. So this led to the intensification of the Cold War, whereby the Russian Soviet Union was angry with that actions following the assassination of Indira Gandhi of India. So in one way or another, the Cold War was intensified through that way. Another was through supporting actual wars. This was another way of intensification of Cold War, whereby each bloc supported the side of that was supporting the ideology. For example, during the Korean War, USSR supported North Korea because North Korea was supporting the communism ideology or communist ideology. On the other end, USA supported South Korea because South Korea was supporting the capitalist ideology. So in one way or another, that intensified the Cold War. Even during the Vietnam War, that was whereby USA supported the West Vietnam and USSR supported East Vietnam. So in that war intensified the Cold War. And the last way was establishment of military bases. Those international military alliances which were formed by those alliances or those superpowers, USA and the USSR and their allies, led to the establishment of military bases in different countries in the world. For example, USA established military bases in Kenya, in South Africa, and the other areas where they had the influences to be protected against their enemies to invade that areas. Even the response by USSR in establishing the military bases in Poland, in Cuba, and other areas where that nations were supporting the communism ideology. After looking the ways on which NATO and the Warsaw Pact intensified the Cold War, let us see another threat to the world peace after the Second World War, which was nuclear arms race. What is the nuclear arms race by definition? Was the competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare between the USA and the USSR and their respective allies during the Cold War. It means that this was the competition in supremacy of warfare between the USA and the USSR during the Cold War. The first nuclear weapon was created by the Manhattan Project during the Second World War, and the USA was the first nation to use it in Japan in 1945. It means the nuclear arms race was occurred during the Cold War when various nations were involved themselves in the production of nuclear weapons. For example, the first nuclear weapons which was made during the Second World War under the Manhattan Project of 1942, that was first used by USA in Japan in 1945, followed by the Pearl Harbor attack by Japan in Hawaii in USA. So in 1941, so that was the nuclear weapons whereby USA dropped the atomic bombs in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So this was the competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare between USA and the USSR. So you can see how those nations were competing in production of nuclear weapons. And on the other side, the USSR came up with intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were tested in Kazakhstan and Balapan as. So that shown the nuclear arms race. Let us see the causes for the nuclear arms race. The first one was the Cold War that existed between USA and the USSR. It means that the Cold War, which was existing between USA and the USSR, intensified the production of nuclear weapons. For example, USA developed the intermediate range ballistic missiles with the production of dangerous weapons. So you can see that those countries were competing in production those nuclear weapons, and on the response by USSR produced the intercontinental ballistic missiles. So these were nuclear weapons or projects which were being established by those enmity blocs that led to the nuclear arms race. Another was the need to maintain balance of power among the super nations. It means that the reason for or cause for the nuclear arms race was to balance the power or balance of power among the super nations. It means that no any nation wanted another nation to dominate over other in nuclear arms race, especially USA and the USSR. So they were competing on supremacist warfare, whereby USA wanted to produce deadly and dangerous nuclear weapons than Russia, and Russia came up with developed and advanced nuclear weapons than the USA. So you can see it was the continuation in the competing of production of nuclear weapons. So they wanted to maintain the balance of power among themselves, though that led to the nuclear arms race. Another was USSR expansionism policy. It means that this was when USSR expanded in different areas in Eastern Europe and the Middle and Central European countries. So that expansionism policy by USSR angered USA to contain the expansionism policy with the aim of spreading communism in those countries. So USA come up with different processes and strategies to contain that policy of USSR to expand itself in Central and the Eastern European nations. For example, the coming of Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine. These were the strategies for containing the expansionism policy of USSR in Eastern nations. So you can see how that led to the arms race or nuclear arms race. Another was cheapness of nuclear weapons than troops. It means that those countries, USA and the USSR, saw that the nuclear weapons were cheaper than the using of troops or military personnel, whereby those people were needed to be paid, but nuclear weapons were supposed to be manufactured or developed the ends to be set to somewhere or to be restored for the use or future use. So this was another cause for nuclear arms race. And the another one was technological advancement factor. During 1945, this was the time when the technology in nuclear weapons production was advanced, and that insisted or influenced many different countries in the world to involve themselves in the production of nuclear weapons. So due to the technological advancement, intensified the nuclear arms race. And the last one was the mistrust between USA and the USSR. It means that this was the situation whereby those two blocs were mistrusting each other. It means that USA did not or were not trusting USA, and the USA did the same. So in that mistrusting led to the production of nuclear weapons to prepare ourselves for their enemies when they attack the member states during that period. So these were the causes of nuclear arms race. After looking at that, let us see the impacts of the nuclear arms race on world peace and the stability. The first impact was it led to the environmental destruction. It means that those arms race or nuclear arms race or nuclear weapons led to the environmental destruction. In which sense? In the way that those nuclear weapons which were developed and manufactured led to the destruction of pollution or destruction of the land, water bodies and the air, whereby harmful gases were produced to the air and harmful chemicals were directed to the water bodies in those projects where the nuclear weapons were manufactured or developed. For example, the testing of nuclear weapons by USSR in Kazakhstan and Balapan led to the production of harmful gases and the destruction of the land, because when the bomb or nuclear weapons is being dropped somewhere, there will be the destruction of the area of that, there will be the destruction of the environment. Another was led to the prohibition of nuclear weapons. It means that the nuclear arms race on the world peace and stability led to the prohibition of production of nuclear weapons to any country in the world, whereby the United Nations decided and signed the treaty that no any nation, whether capitalist or socialist, to produce the nuclear weapons, but that they do not sound. Those nations proceeded to produce those nuclear weapons. This was another impact of nuclear arms race on world peace and stability. The third one was related to the missiles and death. This was another impact in the way that the nuclear weapons or nuclear arms race led to the missile and death among the people, the world. For example, during the Second World War, when the US government dropped the atomic bomb in Japan, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killed almost 74,000 people due to that atomic bombs. So you can see that impact that's caused by the nuclear arms race. Another was it led to the establishment of military bases. It means that the production of nuclear weapons led to the establishment of military bases in different countries of the world. For example, USA established military base in Kenya, in South Africa, and other capitalist nations to defend or to protect their influences against the invasion from their enemies. And the USSR did the same to introduce military bases. So this was another impact of nuclear arms race. And another effect led to the signing of Arms Race Reduction Pact. These were the treaty aimed at reducing the production of arms race or nuclear weapons. So, for example, the USSR president signed the Arms Reduction Pact. So that was the result of arms race or nuclear arms race. But the last one, it increased the world tension, panic, and the military arrogance, whereby those blocs were supporting the actual wars. And for example, during Korean War, whereby USA supported South Korea and USSR supported the North Korea. So those was the impact of nuclear weapons, whereby every bloc or every country, USA and USSR, were defending each other and ensuring the spread of their ideologies in those countries. So these were the impacts of nuclear armed race on world peace and stability. After looking the impact of nuclear armed race impacts, let us see another concept, which is Cuban Missile Crisis, which is just the combination of the second subtopic. The Cuban missiles was the major confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that occurred in October 1963. It means that this was the major confrontation that involved the United States of America and the Soviet Union that occurred in October 1962 over the issue Soviet supplied missile installation in Cuba. It means USSR installed or made the installation of missiles in Cuba. The crisis began when USA discovered that Cuba had secretly installed Soviet missiles which were capable to hit targets across most of the US cities like Chicago, Washington, Los Angeles, and New York. It means that this crisis began when the USA discovered that the Cuba has installed the Soviet missiles and targeting the important cities in USA, which were Chicago, Los Angeles, Washington, and New York City. So the Cuban Missiles Crisis is sometimes known as Caribbean Crisis or October Crisis. To me, the other names of Cuban missiles is Caribbean Crisis or October Crisis. This crisis is regarded by many as the world's closest approach to nuclear war. It means that crisis, which was happened in 1962, was referred or was regarded as the main approach that could bring the occurrence of nuclear war. Let us see the reasons for USSR to launch a missile in Cuba. The first cause was forces of Cold War and superpower tension. This was the first cause whereby the forces of Cold War and the superpower tensions were occurred. This was due to the support of USA this was the support or the introduction of military base in Turkey by USA in Turkey that angered USSR to launch the missile in Cuba and targeting the influential city in USA. So that was the reason for USSR to launch the missile in Cuba. Another factor was economic embargo of USA to Cuba in 1960. This was the economic difficulties which were pressed by USA toward Cuba when the Fidel Castro of Cuba declared that Cuba was become the communist nation. So the USA government brought economic embargo to Cuba that no longer to conduct trade between USA and Cuba. So that's why Russia or USSR decided to launch missile in Cuba, targeting the USA cities. Another was President Kennedy's speech in 1962. The President Kennedy or Joseph F. Kennedy was the USA president and was young president in USA that was conducted a speech with journalists in 1962 and saying that the occurrence of nuclear war is near to happen. because the installation of Cuban missile by USSR was influencing the occurrence of nuclear war that made USSR to launch the missile in Cuba in 1962. Another reason was USA missile in Turkey. The USA missile in Turkey. It means USA, after establishment of missile in Turkey and with the aim of spreading the capitalism ideology and contain the spread of communism in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, the USSR became angry with such situation and made USSR to launch the missile in Cuba, targeting the influential cities in USA and to contain the spread of capitalism in Cuba and other parts of Caribbean and Atlantic regions. Another was to spread communism in Atlantic and the American regions. It means the launch of missile in Cuba by USSR was targeting to spread communism or socialism ideology in Atlantic and the American regions, and that led to USA to be angry with that action. And another cause was the need to test USA strength. It means that the USSR president decided to install the Cuban missile in Cuba to test the strength of president in USA under Joseph Kennedy. So that's why the Nikita Khrushchev decided to place or to install the missile in Cuba. And the last reason was the need to trap USA. And that's why Nikita Khrushchev, after installation of missiles in Cuba, decided to place them in the open place so that USA could see those missiles and to trap them, that at any time when they will start the nuclear war, it will be easy for USSR to bomb the influential cities in USA, and that USA will be no longer the superpower. So that led to the installation or launch of missile in Cuba by USSR. So these were the reasons for USSR to launch missile in Cuba. So after that, there is an exercise here with two questions. The first one is explain the causes for nuclear arms race, and the second one is show the causes of Caribbean missile in 1962. Until there, this is the end of our lesson. Thank you for watching me and welcome in the next section.